In this video, we will be using CurveSuite to create hair for this character model. It will be separated into two parts, where in the first part we will be focusing on the front side of the hair, where the bangs are, and in the second half we will be focusing on the back side of the hair. For both of these halves, we will be using different workflows, so we will be using different modifiers. The base model I'm using for the time being is the body female stylized from the Human Base Meshes package, developed by the Blender Foundation. To start off, I will be adding in a new collection and call it banks, because organizing our objects will be very important. I'll be adding in a UV proxy object, because we will be using deform to UVs. I will offset it on the x-axis so that it is not on the way. And I will add in a new plane object, which will be our banks. And in edit mode, I will be aligning this plane with the character's face. Now at this point, you can either use the mirror modifier, or you can just work mirrored, or if you want an asymmetrical hairstyle, you can just simply forgo this entirely. But if you are using the mirror modifier, you will need to configure this data part so that the UVs are actually symmetrical as well. Another important note is you can use edge slide, but by default, the edge slide operation corrects the UVs as well, which if you perform it on an outer edge loop, you can end up covering less of a space in the UV grid, which is not something we want. It is fine to keep it on for the middle edge loops, but for the most part, you will want the plane object to cover the entire UV grid. This is a good starting point before we start adding our modifiers, because right now it really just feels like we're creating a piece of cloth over the character's face. But once we start adding in modifiers, we'll have a better idea of what we are working with and the sort of changes we will need to be making. But before all that, I will be creating a linked duplicate of this plane object. And within object parameters, I will change the viewport display to a wire, so that once we add modifiers to this plane, we can still have a visualization of what the plane looks like without the modifiers. I will set our cursor to revert the UV proxies. I will add in a pet object. I will be calling this the hair curves. And for our bangs object, I will add in a deform to UVs modifier. I will target the hair curves for our object, and for our UV proxy, I will select the UV proxy object. And then I will separate our viewport to two windows, where one will be focused on the character's face, and the other will be focused on our UV proxy. When working with the curves, it can be useful to have snap to nearest face on. Otherwise, you can end up with situations where the curve itself goes outside of the boundaries of the UV proxy, which then creates these very bizarre shapes. So being limited to the UV proxy can be useful. And we'll be using the draw tool set to surface. And you can either use Bezier curves or poly curves for this part, but if you use Bezier curves, you will end up with these very bizarre shapes on the actual object with the modifier, which can be avoided by using resample curve modifier on the hair curves object, so that the Bezier curve is turned into a poly curve before it is being instanced. Either way, I will keep the resample curve modifiers on our hair curves object as well. And I will also increase the preview resolution to be very high on the data panel, because the resample curve modifiers will actually downsample the curves anyway. So having more data to work with is a good thing. And since our actual plane object is very jagged, no matter how high the curve's resolution is, it will still be jagged on this end as well. So one way to fix this is to add in a subdivision surface modifier. By placing it above our deform to UVs modifier, we can subdivide the surface before we instance the curves on it. One thing that is important to note is that since the subdivision surface modifier also rounds out the other outer edges, if you want the outer edges to be preserved, you will need to select the outer edges and then set them to mean crease value of 1 in an edit mode. I will be adding in a subdivision surface modifier to our curved, or rather the linked duplicate as well, so that they're more uniform. And then in edit mode, I will be adding in new curves to our hair curves object to create an outline for the hair. It can be helpful to add in edge loops to your UV proxy to get an idea of how things line up. Now we can add in a curve to mesh modifier to our main object with the deform to UVs modifier. And I will add in a mesh object to use as a profile this time, which I will name curve profile. You can still use a curve object like we've done in the previous videos. It is up to your personal preference, but I want to make sure that we've also covered different ways to do this. By adding in a resample curve modifier to our main banks object, we can make sure that any sort of glitching with the transference is mitigated. Here you can see that a lot of curve points are being instanced right on the edge of our plane. And since resample curves can resample both by length and by count, it can get rid of those excess points and leave only the ones that matter to us. I will be using an align curve surface modifier. And for our target, I will be selecting our duplicated banks object so that the generated curves line up with the shape we've defined in edit mode. Now my current goal with the curves we've set up so far is to make sure that the radii of these curves is aligned properly and covers the entire face. So I'll be creating a bit of space between the curves that we have placed. If you want a more natural look, you can go ahead and make sure that you displace them as randomly as possible, depending on personal preference, but we can also use modifiers to handle some of the naturalness for the look. I'll get rid of some of the curves you've added to the front side of the hair. And then I'll scale up the tips so that they cover more area. If you don't want to bother editing both sides individually, you can always just work on one side and use mirror curves. But another way is by setting your curve origin to be the object origin. You can make your transform pivot point to your 3D cursor, duplicate your existing curves, and then scale by -1 on the x-axis. And then split the symmetry afterwards by editing. Now that we have our setup going on, I'll be actually adding in a curve to curves modifier to our hair curves. Now, because we set the resolution to be very high, performance is very poor. So at this point, it may be useful to increase the length parameter of your example curves modifier so that editing is a bit faster. And by controlling the x-axis scale of our emitters, we can make the curves stand outside of the UV proxy based on their radius, or while keeping it relatively low and increasing the y scale value. We can make it so that the radius parameter of our initial curves affects how much these curves spread out on the UV proxy. If you want the hair strands to lay perfectly flat on the UV proxy, you can always set the emitter scale to be 0, so that the radius only affects their spacing in the y-axis. Since we're using the radius to handle the separation of our subcurves, we no longer have access to the shaping in edit mode. So I'll be adding in a new curve. Should be our radius proxy. I'll create a link duplicate of our radius proxy and hide it for now. To our radius proxy object, I will be adding in a curve to mesh modifier. And for our profile, I will also be selecting our curve profile. I will increase the scale parameters so that it is a bit more visible from above. And now for our bangs object, I will add in a transfer radius and tilt up parameter or modifier. And now select our radius proxy, the one without the modifier. If we select the one with the modifier, we will not be able to transfer the radius. What this copy allows us to do is see the effect of our change in radius without having to look at our initial object or our final object. It does seem to be reversed, so I will be rotating on the z-axis by 180 degrees because I want the tip to be this side. Now, since we're using the curve to continuous subcurves, the tips of these curves aren't really rotating in this way I want them to. So I will actually go ahead and replace this modifier with the curve to subcurves. But rather than completely replacing it, I will disable this modifier for now. And then I'll just copy the changes I've made over onto this modifier so that I do not have to do it from scratch. but it seems that the scale parameters for the two modifiers are inverse. So what I'll do is change the resample curve modifier so that we get a better performance on our edits. To give the bangs a more natural look, we can also use a displace curves modifier. I'll be selecting our copy of our bangs object without the modifiers as our normal surface. And it seems the curves are actually reversed because the displacement modifier is pushing the part that is meant to be the roots away. So what we can do is go to edit mode with our curves and then perform the switch direction operation. We'll do the same on our radius proxy so that the tips are, or the direction of our radius proxy is reversed as well, so that the sampling for the radius is also reversed. Now our displacement modifier is actually properly displacing the tips. By increasing the scale of the texture, we can have the effect more discrete, where closer curves get a different displacement effect going on. By keeping the value low, we also keep the texture very large, which means that curves are more likely to be displaced in the same direction. Since none of the modifiers are final until we apply them, we can still go to edit mode on our proxy object or the bangs object and make adjustments in edit mode to make the final result fit the face better. By enabling the retopology overlay, we can get a visualization of our bangs object without the modifier underneath our object with the bangs modifier, which can be very useful. We can also even make edits to the UV map directly, which can be a bit tricky to understand or get used to. And since this cannot really be reversed easily at the very least, so I do not really recommend it unless you're absolutely certain you're comfortable with experimenting and getting used to it. And you can see the difference in having the correct UVs enabled or not. If we do not have it enabled, the hair strands are being slid alongside the actual edge loops, but with it enabled, they try to stay in the same place, but having vertices stacked on top of one another in the UV space can cause issues with the instancing. You can see once we have these edge loop stacked on top of the other one, which you can see in the UV editor right here, this part completely freaks out. So you can just create a little bit of gap in the UV space or in the UV editor once that happens if you want. But I prefer to work with correct UVs disabled for the most part. You can also elevate the curve object itself entirely to create a bit of a gap between the generated curves and the actual main banks object. You can also create duplicate curves in our radius proxy to have variation in the strand's radius. so that we can have some strands thicker than the others. If you ever set the strand radius to 0, all tests will no longer change the radius, so you will need to use the item panel within the right-hand side menu to set a value. Since you're working with meshes, you can always just use shape keys to make adjustments. That way, once you make an adjustment, but you're unsure about keeping it around, you can always just toggle the shape key off. You can keep making adjustments to fit what your end goal is, but for now I will be calling this done, and I hope it has covered enough that it has been educational and taught you a few things. Up next, we'll be working on the backside of the hair, which, if you want, you could use a similar workflow, or alternatively, you could even just have a singular plane that covers the entire character's head, which is up to your personal preference. But for the most part, we'll be using a different method to cover as much ground as possible for the backside.